Greetings, open source universe. Welcome to the Open Innovation playlist. The War for the Open Soul. This video has been cooking for a long time and cooking a lot. I had to be very particular with the choice of thumbnail because the point isn't down with GNU, but we're going to turn this bovid on its head and see if we can get some new ideas to fall out. I'm going to start by recapping some history in the 90s. If you're really familiar with open source, I want you to skip ahead to where I'm talking about some of the key conclusions of the Cathedral and the Bazaar. You don't need to watch the graphics in this video, so feel free to go make a sandwich and just listen. I'm going to start telling this story in 1995. The Unix wars have been raging for years, and Linux, which is not a Unix, has won. On the back of a surging x86 market, a radical, organically grown development model with perhaps the OG BDFL, and a license model that enabled a stable two-way flow of value to a central pool, the ecosystem was feeling it, and they rapidly coalesced around the new platform. One of the key programs to emerge on Linux is the Apache web server, and this thing is like the OG virtual private server. It's enabling multi-tenant hosting where you have multiple websites hosted on a single machine, and it's kicking the crap out of IaaS, not just in terms of value, but in terms of features. Using Linux and Apache, a wave of small local hosting companies are popping up, putting people on the internet. This is the original Web 2.0. They are democratizing the internet years before YC exists and says that about every single one of their startups. The combination of the two in the early internet is an economic powerhouse, and a lot of people want to ride the wave. Meanwhile, over at Microsoft, they're celebrating about 95% desktop market share. There is no remaining viable consumer alternative. We're talking about Carlos Slim and Pablo Escobar levels of monopoly money and monopoly power. And there's a very real fear that that level of market dominance is going to lead to something that is dystopian. It's going to let them do things that are unnatural. And we've seen them flex that kind of top-down energy when they bundled Internet Explorer with Windows. And pretty quickly, we went from a competitive web browser market to one where essentially Microsoft wrote the standards. And that's a threat to the idea of the open internet, to Apache Linux, and this self-organizing, organically developed ecosystem. It's very clear that the immovable object is about to be met by the unstoppable force. So how did it go? Let's fast forward to 1999. To reflect on the success of the Linux kernel development process, Eric S. Raymond has just written The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It's talking about attempts to replicate the success of the Linux development process in other projects, and the feeling is that the experiments are showing positive results. And there is also a feeling that at companies with a closed-source development model, where their idea to sell more product is to lock in customers, that the politicking of the management is focused on their survival within a power structure, while the board engineers are merely holding the Maginot lines of their company money printers. And that this degree of gross lack of consideration for the customers or the problems being solved puts them at a significant disadvantage relative to the open source. They cannot possibly overcome the intrinsic goodness of being honestly motivated by the love of tinkering and a personal interest in the problems that they're solving. And Wall Street agreed that the empirical evidence supported these conclusions. You had Cygnus Solutions explode from being a small embedded programming company to making GCC the best compiler on earth. And they will merge with Red Hat, and they will be on CNBC having their IPO the same year. So we're coming for you, Bill Gates, and your armies of bored peon engineers are going to crumble. It was very clear at this time that there is an intrinsic moral goodness to using and creating open source. All of this low-friction, free access to high-quality tools wasn't just making the technology move faster, it was making the businesses move faster, it was making the researchers move faster, it was enabling every individual to do more with their lives. At the same time, the value created by all this rapid movement and innovation is very equitably distributed because of the strong, healthy effects on the competitive environment. It is very difficult to treat your customers poorly when everyone has access to high-quality tools, and your competitive moats are not going to last. So now we can return to the present where the war was won and we all lived happily ever after. Microsoft declared bankruptcy in 2008, Ubuntu Phone is the #1 mobile operating system, and I'm writing this on a computer powered by a fusion reactor with not a microplastic in my body. Except that's not what happened at all. A 2022 Emacs user survey asked the question, how strongly do the ideals of free/Libre software affect your computer use? And the answers are damning. The first option reads, I have a clear preference for free/Libre software and am willing to accept any lack of features and UI polish, while further options go on to specify significant, moderate, or a limited lack of features and UI polish, or some people are not willing to accept any lack of features or UI polish, but there is also no option for I want my free Libre software to be better, and what is this free Libre software, where did open source go? And while the results for that question could have been worse, they definitely weren't good. It was very clear that there had become an accepted premise that using open source means it just has to be bad. This is the language of the post-apocalypse. We're not even fighting the war anymore. We've already lost and we're looking for gasoline in the desert. And what's further concerning is that the way the question is asked is almost like you're supposed to be proud of it. And there are people who are proud of it. They're like, yeah, give me some of that crappy software that doesn't do anything for anybody. The other empirical evidence isn't looking too hot either. While the B2B open source market is looking kinda healthy with about $30 billion in annual revenue, the consumer market is more like a desolate wasteland compared to the year of desktop Linux. We haven't just seen the open platforms fail to expand, but we've seen the even more closed platforms make progress with the walled gardens of Apple. Firefox market share peaked in around 2010 with 32.8%. That was the highest figure that I could find anywhere. And right now, they're sitting at around 3%. And lo and behold, Chrome disables ad blockers. And I gotta tell you, there's something we need to figure out about the uncanny similarity where twice an incarnation of Netscape Navigator was sent packing by a dominant internet incumbent. And finally, we need to ask, if all this is so bad, what's the real harm? Is this abstract harm, or is there real harm where there's something we could have, but we don't have? And if somebody took that away from you, you would have standing in court. Now, ad blockers are kind of silly, but let's take a look at all these subscription services, about half of which don't improve after 6 years. Would you say you're suffering as a consumer or a business whenever you have to pay $6 a month for the same chat client you've had for the last 10 years? When you go home and you want to watch a movie, is there one search box where you can find anything, or are there 10 different services trying to chop up the market with exclusive content? Is this smart competition that helps the consumer, or is this stupid competition that hurts the consumer? Do you use any social services, and do you use them because of their outstanding feature set or because of their network effects and their entrenched dominance? Do you have a consultative relationship with the algorithms and the aggregates that make up these feeds, or are you basically just subject to whatever digital heroin they want? If you were concerned about the amount of top-down energy coming out of Microsoft in 1995, how can you be anything but more concerned about the amount of top-down energy coming out right now from a small group of people who own a small group of social services that have all of the users and are becoming increasingly cozy with the government? This is without even considering the incidental investment we should have in various pieces of open source and other enabling technologies, but hasn't happened and ultimately slows other things down. Can you think of any other industries that rely on foundational IP to push the ball forward, or do you pay 20% of your GDP for healthcare? This is just a sampling of the ways in which stupid competition ultimately hurts all of us, and how a lack of evolution and expansion of open source hurts us in ways beyond just information technology. So I'll stop there, but I think it's safe to say there's some things we're missing that we know we want, and there could be some things that we don't know we're missing. But bottom line, this is not what we came for. We gotta ask, what went wrong? There are some orthogonal things like the rise of Web 2.0 and the natural advantages of centralized web services, but I want to focus on things that compromise the arguments in the Cathedral and the Bazaar. That's what's going to compromise our model for how open source was supposed to succeed. Now, the first thing that happened is not that shocking. The software industry in the 90s might have been dumb, but they learned. A whole generation of programmers who grew up in the open source ecosystems moved to the Bay Area and founded companies that are no longer startups, and these people are not dumb. They didn't bring their 90s software industry habits, but they did bring their copy of Cathedral and Bazaar. Paul Graham, founder of YC, that guy's a lisper. He almost surely had a copy. He probably had a paperback copy. By 2011, this stuff has been translated to business and codified. The Lean Startup is published, written by Eric Ries. It contains timeless wisdom that everybody on Hacker News knows by heart, such as release early, release often, except that's from the Cathedral and the Bazaar. The dirty closed source companies weren't supposed to know all that stuff, but they read the book. And if your strategy relies on your enemy remaining stupid in spite of their overwhelming financial incentive to learn, it's not going to work. And the result is that we were supposed to be going up against Office Space and Dilbert Comics, but instead we're going up against the Mag 7. Google isn't Microsoft in 1995, and Microsoft isn't Microsoft in 1995. This stuff is different. So remember, the argument was that at companies with a closed-source development process, the inherent deficit of virtue would always lead to an inferior work output, but evidently this deficit of virtue was more malleable than expected when people had billions of dollars on the line. But I'm going to argue that this next piece is the biggest logical breakdown that had the most devastating effect. When Eric S. Raymond writes The Cathedral and the Bazaar in 1999, internet adoption is at about 33% in the US. Most of these users are native English speakers. They are in the top third of early adopters, and there is a 1-to-3 ratio with the top 10% of early adopters. And Eric writes, given a bit of encouragement, your users will diagnose problems, suggest fixes, and help improve the code far more quickly than you could unaided. Now stop and think about that for a second. The users will help you improve the code. Those are users who are programmers. When we talk about users in Bay Area language, we mean consumers, and consumers don't code, they pay you to code. The problem that we are hurtling towards is that you've got software that's available for download, and it's relatively cheap, so it's going to be wildly popular relative to its quality. And while in 1999 that might not have been a problem, by 2020 with at least 90% internet adoption and a whole lot of people who don't speak English as their first language or any language, you're going to have a completely insatiable amount of demand. For a VC-backed startup, that's a good problem to have. For an open source maintainer, that's a curse. So we had to engage in demand destruction, and the easiest way was to get burnout and let the features fall behind. So not only are we working at the closed source companies and we're no longer dumb, but when we go home, we're tired of answering all the issues from people who don't know what they're doing, and we just stop answering. Engineers who are answering questions from people who are non-technical are prone to feel that they're no longer doing it for the love of tinkering. They might stop doing it at all. And that means we have compromised the technical artifact, which is no longer being created. That effect is catastrophic, and it is a really painful feeling for the people who get struck with it. Now, the normal way that consumers balance out what would be an awful unfairness with the engineers getting burnt out for nothing is that they pay for things. But when we don't figure out a sales model that makes sense for these users and for these maintainers, we're abandoning them both. So it's time to move on to solutions. But I think it'll be helpful to have some concepts from a pattern that I noticed. In all this work to design a sales model and create a logical pitch, I began to see a pattern of basic goodness and badness that sometimes put the badness in some surprising places. And that pattern is also very helpful in unwinding some weird paradoxes like why is innovation sometimes up by their bootstraps disruption and other times grotesque display of wealth and dangerous power accumulation. Now let's begin with this concept of top-down energy. I think the clearest example to me of a top-down approach comes from the Korean chaebols and the Japanese zaibatsu. You've got a big conglomerate with an attached bank and a close relationship with the government, and it looks a lot like state capitalism. These structures were efficient in industrializing because they centralized decision-making into an efficient hierarchy that could deploy capital at a large scale decisively. They make decisions at the top of that hierarchy. There's not that many high-level decisions to be made, and the most important thing is to get everything moving in the same direction at the same time. Now, after industrialization, it has become part of the social discourse that there are too many things that are top-down. We need to find a way to have more things that are bottom-up. They need more small businesses and SMEs, and especially high-risk startups to break the logjam, but they don't necessarily have that strong of culture in that kind of investing and that kind of entrepreneurship as exists in the Bay Area. Now you can have too much top-down, but you can also have inherent problems within top-down. One of the biggest things is that they start to eliminate mobility. Their structure is very rigid. The hierarchy has a tendency to start abusing power to enforce the hierarchy, and then nobody can go anywhere. And that breaks the incentive alignment and sometimes causes the whole thing to grind to a halt. A second thing that can emerge within things that are very top-down is they begin to externalize failure. When the hierarchy as a whole isn't performing but it's too strong to break apart, it can remain intact in spite of its failure. The whole world knows it's not working, but inside the halls of the cathedral, we're doing just great. And when that happens, you'll get a lot of rationalization, but not a lot of reality. And if you can leave, you should leave, but now you're part of the externalized failure, and that's why the organization never sees it and never feels it. So what's bottom-up energy like? We saw a great example in the Linux Apache era. You had everybody coalescing around Linux independently. They were making their own decisions. It was self-organizing. It was organic, and it all started with individuals. At its foundation, the internet has a lot of bottom-up energy because people can connect point to point at very low cost in almost any configuration. But that is not the end of the story because the platforms and tools that we use change the topology of how we're connected. Our fragmentation across platforms changes which communities talk to which, and if you read The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Eric references an idea that's been around for a while and often repeated that the structure of an organization determines its behavior. And so the structure of how we're connected through the tools that we use can affect a lot of our behavior. It affects the chemistry of the outcome. Now, this next idea is helpful in understanding When can coalescence happen? Where is self-organization going to occur? The total massive benefit of achieving any kind of self-organization comes from the sum of each individual benefit. When it is very obvious that many people will benefit from something and they all know about it, that self-organization is just spontaneous and organic. It's very easy for it to happen at a very large scale. With the latest president to get impeached, the massive benefit was clearly on the side of the people to self-organize and say, no, we don't want to go back to a 1980s style dictatorship. This is a country with a lot of top-down legacy, but a crazy amount of bottom-up energy. But the massive benefit is not a complete predictor because it doesn't tell you about the gradient of benefit. If one person is revolting in a rigid system, they are not going to achieve anything. If you're trying to fight a war of independence, the costs and the risks are higher, and it takes a greater massive benefit to get to the other side. When we look at the math of getting a lot of people in one place to coordinate on something, the low cost and low risk to the individuals who move first is important. To conclude this section, let's take a look back at technology and innovation. When all startups begin, they have a lot of bottom-up energy. Whenever they fail, they end up dispersing a lot of capital and wealth across a lot of places, and that has a lot of bottom-up energy. Whenever they succeed, they end up dethroning an incumbent, which is part of the enforcement of the competitive cycle, but then they themselves become the incumbent. And so when we think about the equitability of the value that is created by technology and innovation, it is extremely important to differentiate between the entrenched incumbents and the people who are burning capital chasing after them and trying to get around them. So now let's talk about how we're going to win the next round. The first thing that is just a given is that we have to embrace specialization. That means I do a job that I'm good at, and I pay somebody else to do jobs I'm not good at. There was a time when we thought that computer skills would become ubiquitous, like math, where everybody needs to know it. When people came up with that idea, what they meant was math like addition and subtraction, but the skills that are actually needed are more like partial differential equations and perturbation theory. It is just implausible to think that every single person is going to be an expert at every single thing. I need a lawyer, a dentist, a doctor. I cannot cook some of the food that I can eat at a restaurant. Now, part of the reason why some people were so keen on such ubiquitous computer literacy was essentially because we thought, okay, then the people can help themselves and this self-help model of software development can work. And the reason it's such wishful thinking is imagine any other profession coming out and saying, you all need to have a high degree of literacy in my field so that I don't need to sell you any services. Chances are you probably don't want to know as much about their job as they do, and you'd prefer that they do it even if you did know it. The software is more complex than it was in 1984 because the problems that it solves are harder and the consumer expectations are higher. As the skill requirement goes up, software becomes intrinsically economic. I do not want to know how to give myself a root canal. On the surface, it might seem like this idea of ubiquitous computing skills is some kind of bottom-up energy, but what it really amounts to is a return to Neolithic society and a breakdown of cooperation and the interdependence of people with specialized skills. So how do we do it? We just need a sales model that works for consumers. There are some that are out there that we should use more, and I am working on a better one. The second thing is that we have to give ourselves the freedom to invade closed platforms. This notion that we're helping the closed platforms and supporting them whenever we use them is insane. A lot of open source software was bootstrap compiled on closed source tools. What can be more good bottom-up energy than invading the evil kingdom, going into the evil workshop and using the evil tools to build the good tools and overthrow the evil kingdom? The second reason is just obvious. You have to go where users are if you want to get users. Momentum is such a huge factor in how people use toolchains, and when they use a good toolchain on a closed platform, they are very comfortable taking that good toolchain back to an open platform. Developers pay attention to who's looking out for their interests, and when Google spends a bunch of DevRel money to make their experience nice, but the FSF says they need to get lost or live poor and sacrifice for their users, guess what they do? Asking people to fight with you uphill in the snow with one arm tied behind their back or else be excluded is not bottom-up energy. That is top-down enforcement of dogma. And what ends up happening? You externalize failure. Those users go away and everybody's on board, but it's a very small boat. The third thing that needs to happen is we have to expand the domain, and this should have happened a long time ago. The idea that you can only care about software when you want to care about IP is insane. We should have been talking about open innovation and expanding from open software a long time ago. We need to go through all technology, all media, all basic research. We have to get beyond the things that only matter to programmers or things that only programmers think should matter to other people. Again, people know who is looking out for their interests, and when your only answer is to say, hey, stop liking that other technology and learn Prolog instead so I don't have to give you support, guess what's going to happen? And that laser focus on software belies a lack of consideration for the massive benefit for most people. And guess how well that goes over in the various capitals around the world. The last thing that we need to figure out is that open means plural, and that plural is good. When you have people showing up and they have independent interests, those interests do not always overlap. And so the idea that everybody needs to be in one power structure with one consensus for every single thing is just insane. It's unnecessary. It creates friction with groups that don't have anything to do with one another. There are some times where technical consensus means we need to get one answer, like when you're making an RFC, if you're making a spec. But there are other times when there is an unnecessary, forced total consensus. To give you an example, in the Nix Foundation last year, there was a big blow-up, and there was one group that, as far as I can tell, they wanted to exclude Anduril and anybody associated with Anduril. And in a pluralist situation, what would happen is you'd say, yeah, you can protest outside the Anduril tent at the Nix conference, but instead what ended up happening was a fight over a total consensus, where it was like an attempt to completely usurp the governance structure in order to finally exclude everybody associated with Anduril. And the people being excluded had no problem working alongside the people wanting to exclude them. And another example is when the FSF manages a software project, they need to be able to incorporate people who do not believe in the FSF ideology. That is how you operate in a pluralist manner. And that extends to not lording over the technical processes for fear of losing control. To go back to the Cathedral and the Bazaar, here's Eric S. Raymond again. In April of 1999, the Free Software Foundation, the official sponsors of the GCC, dissolved the original GCC development group and officially handed control of the project over to the EGCS steering team. And that was because they had run an experiment which was a pluralist solution to see if another method would work. Experimentation is just part of the game, and you cannot get that without diversity, and you cannot get that without embracing this idea of pluralism. For my closing remarks, I want to start with one of my favorite sayings, which is, don't hate the player, hate the game. Lots of times, the decisions and behaviors of people are largely controlled by the shape of the world that they are in. So if you want to change the behavior, you're going to have to find a way to change the game within the rules of the world that you are in. So where are we going to kick off round 3 of the War for the Open Soul? The first thing is we're going to revisit Web 2.0 because it turns out a lot of these SaaS companies are a lot less defensible than first imagined. A lot of these DHT technologies are mature and they are cool, and there is a lot of capital around them that is non-traditional, that is coming from weird places in crypto and exchanges and ERC20 tokens, which is a bit of a cancerous mess, but it's going to get spent somewhere, so you might as well do something good with it. On the more traditional side of things, you only need to take inspiration by driving out to the middle of rural Nebraska. You're going to find a grain silo, and guess what? They're not normally owned by one farmer. They were probably built by a co-op. It might have been government backed in terms of its finance, but the idea is pretty simple. A bunch of people need a resource. That resource costs money. They pull money to make it cost effective for everybody. You just have to figure out the sales and business model and how to connect people into the agreement. And the big thing that we cannot afford to gift away to stupid competition is Gen AI and AGI development and research. The change that is already occurring is as big as the advent of the internet, and so it's an opportunity to determine the shape of technology for probably the next few decades. And so we can't do what some people did during the Web 2.0 era and tell consumers to stop liking it and businesses to stop making money. It didn't work then, it's not going to work now. We have to innovate. Remember, good open source means that you're going to have millions of users, and millions of users means millions of simple questions. And what are LLMs pretty good at? Saying what everybody knows in whatever language the user wants. And the last thing I'll say is that if you don't have the energy to innovate, there's one last thing I'll bring up from the Cathedral and the Bazaar. When you lose interest in a program, your last duty is to hand it off to a competent successor. Well, that was a lot of talking, a lot of cooking, and a lot of research. I am in dire need of a hamburger. I want you to talk to people who are interested in this kind of stuff and help me set the stage to expand the definition. We want to evolve how we talk about finance for the consumer side, and we want to get back on track and delivering a ton of value to a lot of people and killing off stupid competition. Peace.